This is the Week in Sustainability from Sustain.Life. It's where our team of sustainability experts and practitioners share commentary to keep you up to date on developing stories and news.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Week in Sustainability. I'm Melissa Ray, Chief Sustainability Officer at Sustain.Life. And today's news story is a big and exciting one. It's always exciting when we pass a new climate disclosure bill or law, but what is perhaps overlooked and even more exciting is when those bills get the funding they need to actually be implemented. So today's story is all about California's new budget that's going to fund the SB 253 and 261 climate package bills. I am joined today by Stephen Rothstein, Managing Director at Ceres. For those who don't know, Ceres is a nonprofit advocacy organization that is working to accelerate the transition to a cleaner, more just, and sustainable economy. And they work with a very powerful network of investors and industry companies to gather that stakeholder effort and perspective. So, Stephen, thank you so much for joining us on this week's episode.
Thank you for the invitation and for all you're doing to share information with your listeners.
Absolutely. So before we dive in, and I know Ceres had such a critical role really in this dialogue and again, gathering that kind of stakeholder engagement and support for this bill. Um, can you just spend a little bit of time introducing yourself and our listeners to Ceres and all the incredible work you do across broad sustainability and what that looks like in the climate space specifically?
Sure, happy to. And there's more information on our website, Ceres, CERS.org. People can take a look. So Ceres, we're in our 35th year. We have a few hundred employees. We're in over 30 states where employees are based. And we do a number of things. First, we represent investors. Our institutional investor network is about $45 trillion of assets under management. So helping them to think about net zero plans. We work with some of the largest companies, including many Fortune 500 companies, again, to help them on their sustainability journey from the supply chain to the boardroom. We work on policy things, including this obviously important California two-piece legislation, but in Congress, internationally, in many other states, and with regulators from the SEC and the Federal Reserve. Fundamentally, our belief is that climate risk is financial risk is climate risk, and the more information people have, the better they'll be, both from a climate perspective, but also from a safety and soundness of their company and their investor.
Absolutely. Well, you are in such good company here. And I know this is a conversation that you and I have also had directly before, but climate risk is financial risk. These regulations, these bills are not coming out of thin air. There is a deep history of investor driven demand for this information because it is financially material to how they price risk and allocate that capital. And so we spend so much of our time at Sustain.Life supporting companies that are now covered by this compliance, or even that supply chain network effect of scope 3 emissions are required. So your customers are now asking you, the supplier, for this information. But always really important to contextualize for everybody that the laws don't exist to make things difficult or onerous, although that's how they may feel. This has a real tangible benefit of providing clarity to the market, to capital markets and to investors so that they can efficiently allocate capital. And that's undeniably what a sufficient and sustainable economy is really all about, right?
Absolutely. I don't think there's no senior leader at a company or an investor who, if you said to them, would you like less information about inflation, less information about pandemic, what's going to happen in Ukraine, and fill in the blank, no one would say it. They always want more information. And at a time, I'll just take the pandemic, when it just was upon us, people said, oh, the information's not perfect. Don't do anything. No, they said, gather as much as you can. And then in 3 to 6 months, let's look at it again. We have more
Hmm.
information. On climate, we have massive amount of information now. There's thousands of companies reporting, lots of information, and it's better than it was 5 years ago,
Hmm.
dramatically. And 5 years from now, it'll be even better.
Yep.
So what companies do, and what investors do, is they project the future. Where should I build a plant? Should I acquire this company? What market demand will be this Christmas for this product? They have
Hmm.
to make projections,
Yeah.
and the more information they have, their projections will be better.
Yep. It's funny that we get into this because so much of the disclosure that's out there now, whether it's the SEC rule here in the States or CSRD over in the EU, is asking companies to make forward-looking statements and projections, right? What's your transition plan? What is your identified risk and opportunity? What financial impact do you expect that may have on your company? What are you doing to mitigate that impact? And there seems to be sometimes there can be a little bit of pushback or discomfort about making these forward-looking statements specific to climate, but that's what you're doing when you build your company's resilience strategy anyway. You are constantly making decisions, as you said. Where do we build that next plant? What's going to be the most financially beneficial and sensible location, workforce base, tax advantage, whatever it is to do that? And now that climate is such a financially material component to incorporate into those decisions and disclosures, it just makes sense that we have these laws that are trying to standardize and harmonize the way in which companies are disclosing that already demanded and material information to investors in capital markets.
Exactly. And the risks affect everybody. I mean, just a few statistics. The federal government, NOAA, said that in the 80s, the United States had $1 billion storm every 4 months. Last year is every 12 to 13 days. 12 to 13 days. Last year, 2.5 million people were forced to move from their homes because of climate risk. That millions of people can't get insurance, and millions more, it's going up 20, 50, 100%.
Hmm.
And it affects the markets overall. It also obviously, especially affects marginalized friends and neighbors even
Hmm.
more so. But from a marketplace, if you care about where your employees live or where your supply chain or anything else,
Yep.
it either has affected you or will affected you. Over 60% of the counties in the United States had a climate emergency in the last 3 years. And that doesn't count the transition risk, which are, I'll take an example. If you sell spark plugs, well, 10 years from now, they're not going to be buying a lot of spark plugs with EVs. So are you planning for the future? And
Yep.
conversely, if you're selling a widget that goes into a solar or a wind or carbon capture, your demand is going to grow. So
Yep.
there's enormous opportunities, enormous risks due to transition.
Absolutely. It's funny. I often like to use the EV example as well for the identifying market based risks and opportunities. If you're not planning for that consumer class, you've missed a really critical buying market for your product, and you're going to see dwindling sales if you're only anchored in combustion engines, right? Yep. Okay. So if the audience can't tell, Stephen and I are both very passionate about climate policy and the transition to net zero, but let's focus on the story at hand, the funding package that was approved and announced for California's climate bills. So before we dig into that, Stephen, take us through a little bit of background and reminder. We have two bills here, SB 253, SB 261, that are requiring the disclosure of greenhouse gas emissions and then climate related financial disclosures for companies over a billion and 500 million in revenue in California, right?
So there we have two laws now that they've been enacted. So
That's
what
right.
had been called SB 253, the Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act, what that said is that if there's a company that's doing business in California that has at least $1 billion of revenue, that they would identify their greenhouse gas emissions, scope one, scope two, scope three,
Hmm.
based on the greenhouse gas protocol. It's been around for 20 years. And the question about doing business in California has not been defined yet. While
Hmm.
the law has passed, the regulations haven't yet. So while I think we have a good sense of what it's likely to be, we don't know definitively. And then the next one is what again had been called SB 261, Senate Bill 261, the
Hmm.
Climate Related Financial Risk and Disclosure Act. That is for companies that are half a billion or more, and
Hmm.
that is to include their TCFD, their Task Force for Climate Related Disclosure. So this
Hmm.
is everything from looking at their governance and metrics and risks and those kinds of processes. But we
Hmm.
view them as a package.
Okay.
And while they're packed, they're obviously separate laws. One for those, again, half a billion, one for a billion. But
Hmm.
overall, these are national legislation that will affect thousands of companies. And almost every company that is $1 billion or half a billion is doing business in California. Because as you know
Right.
so well, if California were its own nation, it would be the fifth largest market, depending, some people call it the fourth largest, depending how you count things, in the world. So most large companies have some presence in the state of California.
That's right. Okay, and now you mentioned this, but for our readers that are maybe a little less familiar, or I should say listeners, less familiar with like the legislative process, what are the key distinctions in terms of bill gets proposed, regulation get or law gets passed, and then regulations come into effect? Because that seems like quite a tiered approach that we get so focused on the initial announcement or the initial vote, right? But that's not the end of the story of what needs to happen to that piece of policy for it to actually be implemented and put into place to have the effect that it was intended to have.
Exactly. So the Governor Newsom signed these 2 bills last October of '23, and then they were each, let's say, half dozen pages, maybe it was 5 pages, I don't remember exactly, and then part of it is that they need to have regulations written because there's a lot of details that weren't in the legislation. Again, that's not for a legislative job, somebody more detail. So that
Mm,
the regulatory agency that they picked was the CARB, California Air Resources Board.
mhm,
California Air Resource Board said, well, that they need staff to do this because it's a slightly different project, not slightly, significantly different project than what they've done. So in the original budget that the governor proposed in January, he
mhm,
said, hey, the state's in a deficit. We don't have money for any new thing. And so there's, let's say it's 100, I don't know exactly, things that I'm not going to provide money for that were
mhm.
enacted last year. In what's called the May revise, when that got updated just a few weeks ago, the governor announced that he was supporting money for the California Air Resources Board. So it still needs a final vote from the legislature, but we know that there is strong support in the Assembly and the Senate, and obviously the governor supported it. And
Mhm.
Ceres has been very involved. About 2 weeks before the governor announces, we submitted a letter. We organized a letter from 35 companies who said that they thought this was a big priority. So we are excited about this, and we're hopeful that the California Air Resources Board will be able to start their regulatory work on July 1st.
Okay, so that's exciting stuff. And now you mentioned that there was this cross industry letter that was written by some of the large companies. What's been from your experience, because I know you work so deeply in that network of stakeholder engagement with industry and investors, what has been the industry and investor response to this legislation in particular? There's, so much of what we talk about is on global consistency, alignment, harmonization. This bill is not in a vacuum. This is not the only bill of its kind. So, what is it that you're hearing from companies in terms of what they're looking for from the legislature and from California in implementing a bill like this across the broader context of what we're seeing across global jurisdictions?
Sure. So the companies and investors, there are many that were very supportive during the legislative process. Some wrote letters, some actually flew to Sacramento to meet with members of the assembly, members of the Senate. And many of the leading companies, I'll give you some examples in just a minute, some names, said, we support climate disclosure. Some have been doing it for years, some over a decade, scope one, scope two, and some even scope three, and why they think it's so important, but they also want consistency. No one wants a patchwork. And right now, without these regulatory, we have a climate Tower of Babel where there's lots of information, but it's
Mhm.
not consistent. And the hope is between the SEC, California, what's happening internationally, they're all
Mhm.
using the same framework of TCFD and
Yep.
greenhouse gas protocol, and that they get to have interoperability. But some of the companies that publicly endorsed this last year, and there were literally dozens,
Mhm.
Patagonia and Microsoft and Adobe and Everlane, seventh generation, Levi Strauss, Grove, many, many, many others
Mhm.
that supported it. So, and there are some companies who didn't want it. Some companies, if you ask them to fill in the sentence, do you want the government to regulate? If you fill in
Right.
whatever the question is, they'll say no,
Mhm.
and I respect that. But there are many leading companies who absolutely supported this.
Yep. Yep. Okay. And then with support comes opposition, right? So there is a lawsuit that's currently filed. What is that looking like right now? This is something that isn't surprising whenever we talk about this. This is very much how the US at the state level, at the national level, this is what the legislative process looks like, right? These things are not unexpected. And so, what's the basis for the claim for that suit?
Well, I don't want to, let me answer generally, but I don't want to pretend I'm speaking for them. I
Sure.
don't agree with them at all. But
Yep.
the US Chamber and the California Chamber and others have said that the law goes too far in terms of freedom of speech. It's what's called
Hmm.
compelled speech and
Yeah.
some other claims. We think, I'm not a lawyer, but I've talked to many, many lawyers
Yeah.
and feel that this law is on very solid ground. We
Yeah.
know the state is vigorously defending it. The California Attorney General has filed things. I also would encourage anyone who's listening who wants to get involved to defend this or support it. There's a regulatory process, there's a litigation process. We'd love to have anyone join with us throughout this process.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, it's something that we talk about. It's obviously something in the news, but again, when you look at that global comparability of what's happening in other jurisdictions, it's pretty clear. Call me biased, and of course, I'm no attorney myself. The law doesn't go too far. It's actually a very simple and streamlined law. Even the way that it was written, I recall, it is very direct. It is very short. It is very brief, right? Especially when you compare it to the 900 pages of the SEC rule. And so I think if you look at this, it's pretty easy to tell this is not so different. This is not so frankly like ambitious compared to other disclosure requirements that we're seeing. This is really just meeting the basic market demands of what investors have been requiring of companies to disclose for decades, quite frankly. And it
Yeah.
is now just raising that lower bar. It's not even really pushing that top bar forward. It's about standardization and interoperability, as you said.
Exactly. So, I mean, just as context, we met with the SEC to talk about climate disclosure for the first time in 2003, 21 years ago, with investors. In the recent SEC filing, we did an analysis of institutional investors. So, 320 institutional investors filed, representing $50 trillion of assets. To put it in context, more investors filed on the SEC rule on climate disclosure than anything in the 91 years of SEC, than anything.
Mhm. Yep.
And we did an analysis. Over 95% of investors supported using TCFD, scope one, scope two, scope three. So,
Yep.
and the same kind of issues in California. So that this has broad support. Again, investors are looking
Yeah.
out not at the next quarter, but the next quarter century.
Yep.
And the average person who's working today will retire in 23 years. So think about what the world's going to be like in 23 years from now. And I often think of the world in that context through my granddaughter, who's just 15 months old, and what the world and to say the world's not going to be different, and you don't want more information. That's not meeting your fiduciary duty.
Yep. I totally agree. I think it's so important to remember this was an investor born, investor driven requirement. TCFD came from an investor community. It was chaired by Michael Bloomberg when it came into formation in 2015. This is not, frankly, an impact driven disclosure. And that's not what the law is based off. This isn't about broad stakeholders wanting to, even decarbonize. It is about risk and disclosure and financially material information that also happens to have the better benefit of driving talk towards a long-term and resilient future, because that is the direction that the economy needs to go in if it's going to be a stable one, right? If it's going to be a
Right.
habitable planet with functioning businesses and societies and infrastructure long term, as you said.
That is absolutely the way the economy needs to go. But this, as you say so brilliantly, these laws are just disclosure. In other words, a company could say, I want to invest more in oil and more in natural gas or more in coal. There's nothing in these laws that would prevent this. This
Hmm.
just says share that information and then the market will decide.
Yeah.
And if the market says that's okay, great. Then according to these laws, I mean, all these are disclosure.
Hmm.
These are not decarbonization and these are not divestment.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about the funding for just a moment. So this is $22 million that was spread across mostly hiring decisions, right? Across CARB, the enforcement agency, to actually review the information, enforce fines and penalties. What is this money actually being allocated towards and on what time horizon?
So some of these issues have to be decided by CARB, but generally it's for them to hire staff so that they can write the rules, go through a public process. And again, any of your listeners who want to participate in that process, I encourage you to do that.
Hmm.
It'll probably happen in the fall and winter. Then once the rules are finalized, probably in early 25, then to have There has to be a way to submit the information, kind of a public website or disclosure,
Hmm.
whether it's CARB or they contract out
Yep.
to do that, and then to analyze it. Once the laws have been implemented, there is it's self-supporting because it's a fee based. So if you're a company, $1 billion company, you'll file a small amount for a filing fee. So
Hmm.
after the first year, the fees will cover the cost. So it's really needed cost just to get it up and running.
Yep. Okay. Great. It's that minutia, it's that detail that you often don't think about, but little things, building the website, building the IT infrastructure, the mechanism to literally deliver and report the information, that takes money, right? And so that's what this
Right.
is
I
for.
mean, many of your listeners may use, the SEC has something called Edgar, kind of their website where you can look at filing. And so I'm not saying it needs an exact equivalent, but some
Hmm.
kind of tracking. And one of the things is how is the information tagged? Because if you just submit it and there's
Right.
tens or hundreds of thousands of pages or millions of pages, you won't be able to find things. So find out what's the right standard, what kind of tagging, those kind of operational things are what the regulatory process would determine.
Right. Right. Okay. So to wrap this up, we've got our rules passed. We have our laws. We're getting our regulations written out to a T. We have money to support these things. What should companies, all of our listeners on the line, as this moves forward and becomes more finalized, what should they be doing to prepare now to make sure that they're ready for when compliance time comes?
Yeah. So first is many of the companies will have to submit reports to Europe, CSID before California state. So they should be getting ready. And we think of this as a ladder, meaning if your company hasn't done anything on climate disclosure, set up a cross team committee and start to gather information. If you've started that, analyze your scope one. If you've done that, look at scope two. If you've done that, look at scope three, kind of wherever you are. And
Hmm.
I've read enough of these reports now that the first year you do it, it's not perfect. And so you'll find methodology and you'll get better and better and better. So you should be collecting this information. I know of many, many, many companies that are collecting this information now, even though they're
Hmm.
not filing it, and they're using it as an internal planning because often it helps them with their acquisition strategy or their purchasing or their supply chain or
Yep.
their other kinds of issues. So wherever you are, go to the next step, talk to your industry group. There's often an industry group that has common data or a work group or things like that. And be ready for this again, because there is the California, the SEC, and then for those that are international, there'll be those. If you're not in a decision making role in a company, go to the companies where you shop and ask them, or where you work and ask them. Because again, the California laws, unlike the SEC, covers large public and private companies. So
Yep.
it's not just publicly traded companies.
Yep. And I think I'd say, like a big evolution and distinction that we are seeing now in the disclosure realm, that traditionally it has been the public companies because it's this, public market and investor driven disclosure requirements. And now we are seeing more and more private companies either mandated, but also really compelled to disclose this information because, again, it's financially material. And this is what the allocators of capital and actors really want to know. And I will just echo what you're saying in terms of start now, right? Because it is a process. This isn't rocket science, but it is tricky, right? This is new information that you're gathering about your company. You're going to want to make sure that you have good data governance and internal controls. And that system and procedure takes time to build to really get comfortable with your information. As you said, the factors you're using, methodologies. You may change for our technical folks on the line the consolidation approach that you want to use in your emissions disclosure. This is a process that you learn more every time you go, just like across every other discipline of your business. You're not going to get it right the first time. The point is to start doing it and to learn and make the best informed decisions and judgment calls of what best and most accurately reflects your business so that you can provide that clear and consistent communication.
Absolutely. I mean, I'll give you one example. For some companies, they tie this in with their accounting software so that they want to. I give you if you have a company and you have 10 manufacturing facilities in 5 countries, well, just getting electric bills from 5 different countries and different languages, that's a process. and how are you tracking that and measuring that? So again, you might have a system already in place, your accounting system maybe, or you're in a particular company where that doesn't make sense. So there's no one way to do this for every company because every company is different. But it's important to look at this and know that this is coming.
Absolutely. Stephen, I want to thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your insight, and your passion with all of our viewers. Thank you so much for joining the episode today.
Thank you. Thanks for all that you're doing. And again, look forward to working with any of the folks listening who want to get involved. Please reach out to Ceres.
Absolutely. All right, folks, that's all we have for you today. Thanks so much for joining, and we will see you next week for another week in sustainability.
Sustain.Life is the leading and most comprehensive sustainability software on the market. To learn how we can help your company measure its emissions and take climate action, go to Sustain.Life. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this show on our YouTube channel or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for tuning in. See you next week.